The courtroom was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock hanging high above the judge's bench. The air felt thick, like it carried the weight of unspoken truths and broken dreams. In the center of it all stood a frail woman, gray hair tied neatly, hands trembling as she clutched a worn-out purse. Her eyes were tired, but behind them was a fire that life hadn't managed to extinguish yet. Her name was Margaret Thompson, a widow from a small rural town. She had lost her husband, a construction worker 2 years earlier in a tragic site accident. The company he worked for claimed it was his own fault and refused to pay any compensation. Since then, Margaret had been living on scraps, barely keeping up with rent, and struggling to pay for her medication. This day was supposed to be her chance for justice, her final plea in court against the powerful construction company that had destroyed her life. She had no lawyer. She couldn't afford one. She had come alone, representing herself, holding only a stack of papers and an old photograph of her late husband smiling in his work uniform. But as she spoke, her voice quivered. Her words stumbled. The opposing attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, smirked as he interrupted her again and again, objecting to nearly every sentence she tried to utter. And the judge, a man known for his impatience and arrogance, sighed loudly, rolling his eyes as if her pain was an inconvenience to his day. "Mrs. Thompson," the judge said sharply, "we've already been over this. There is no evidence of wrongdoing by the company. I'm dismissing your case." Margaret's lips trembled. She took a step forward, desperate. "Your Honor, please. They lied. My husband didn't ignore safety rules. The equipment, it malfunctioned. They knew it was faulty." The judge slammed his gavel down, cutting her off. "Enough! Case dismissed." A wave of laughter erupted from the company's side of the courtroom. Their attorney chuckled quietly, packing his briefcase. The judge smirked faintly and muttered, "Court adjourned." Margaret just stood there, frozen. Her heart pounded, her vision blurred with tears. She tried to speak again, but her voice was gone. The bailiff approached, gently guiding her toward the door, as if she were some lost soul who didn't belong there anymore. As she stepped outside the courtroom, people whispered. Some pitied her. Others didn't even notice her at all. She walked down the courthouse steps, the wind cold against her face, and sat on the stone bench outside. She didn't cry. She couldn't. She just stared at the photo of her husband in her hand, whispering softly, "I tried, Robert. I really tried." What Margaret didn't know was that someone had been watching, someone who'd been following her story from the beginning. 2 weeks earlier, when her local newspaper had printed a small column about her upcoming case, a group of men at a diner had noticed it. They weren't lawyers. They weren't journalists. They were bikers, rough-looking, leather-jacketed men who rode for a cause. They called themselves the Guardians of the Road. They weren't a gang, not in the way people usually thought. They were veterans, ex-cops and working-class men who'd made it their mission to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. They raised money for struggling families, escorted abused children to court, and sometimes just showed up when someone needed to be reminded that they weren't alone. Their leader, a tall, broad man named Hank Bulldog Rivers, read Margaret's story while sipping his coffee that morning. He set the newspaper down and said to the others, "No one's helping this woman. That ain't right." So when the day of the hearing came, Hank and 6 others rolled out, engines roaring, vests patched with their emblem, a winged wheel wrapped in barbed wire. They parked outside the courthouse, but when the case ended so abruptly, they were too late to make it inside. They saw Margaret sitting on that cold bench, her shoulders slumped, and they knew justice had failed again. Hank walked up slowly, removing his sunglasses. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you Margaret Thompson?" She looked up, startled by the towering figure. His beard was streaked with gray, his arms covered in tattoos, but his eyes were kind. "Yes, I am. Who are you?" He smiled faintly. "Friends. You mind if we sit?" She nodded, unsure what else to say. The group sat around her, 7 bikers in leather jackets forming a quiet circle of protection. People walking by stared, whispering. "We read your story," Hank said. "You were fighting the company that hurt your husband, right?" Margaret sighed. "I tried. But the judge didn't care. No one ever does," Hank nodded slowly. "That's not how this should end." He stood up, looking toward the courthouse doors. "Stay right here, ma'am." Then, without another word, the bikers turned and walked back into the building. Inside, The courtroom was nearly empty. Only the company's lawyer and a few assistants remained, laughing and talking about their easy win. But the laughter stopped the moment the doors swung open. The sound echoed, boots on tile, leather creaking, a low rumble of purpose. 7 bikers walked in, shoulders squared, expressions hard as stone. The lawyer's grin faded instantly. The judge, still gathering his papers, looked up in shock. "Excuse me," he barked. "You can't just walk in here. Court is over." Hank stopped in the center of the room. "Yeah, we know," he said calmly. "But we need to have a word." The bailiff stepped forward, but Hank raised his hand. "Relax, officer. We're not here to cause trouble. We're here because something wrong just happened in this room." The judge frowned. "Who are you people?" Hank took a slow step closer. "We're the people who read the paper, the people who care when others don't." The lawyer tried to interrupt, but Hank's gaze silenced him. "That woman you just mocked, that widow, she came here for justice, not humiliation. And you laughed in her face." The judge looked uncomfortable. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but—" Hank cut him off. "I know exactly what we're doing. We're making sure you remember her name." One of the bikers pulled out a small folder. "We've got evidence, Judge. The kind her husband's company didn't want anyone to see. Safety inspection report, worker testimonies, leaked maintenance logs, all showing that the equipment that killed her husband was faulty, and that they knew it." The courtroom went silent. Even the judge's clerk froze, eyes wide. Hank dropped the folder on the desk with a heavy thud. "That's the truth. You dismissed her case without even listening. But now everyone's going to hear it," the lawyer stammered. Where did you get this?" "From people who still have a conscience," Hank said simply. "The workers who watched your company bury the truth." The judge sat back, speechless. He looked down at the folder, then back up at Hank. "This is highly irregular. So is letting a widow be crushed by the system," Hank shot back. "You've got 2 choices, Your Honor. Either reopen that case, or we take this evidence straight to the media. And trust me, the media loves a story about a corrupt courtroom and a grieving widow." The lawyer's face went pale. The judge hesitated, sweat forming at his temple. Finally, he sighed. "Fine," he muttered. "Bring her back in." Outside, Margaret was still sitting on the bench, unaware of what was happening inside. She looked up as the doors opened and saw Hank smile. "Come on, ma'am," he said softly. "It's your turn again." When she walked back into the courtroom, everyone stood silent. Even the judge's tone had changed. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "it appears new evidence has come to light. I am reopening your case." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. She looked at Hank and whispered, "How did you—" He just nodded. "You don't need to fight alone anymore." The new hearing began that same afternoon. With the bikers sitting behind her like an unshakable wall of support, Margaret found her voice again. She spoke clearly, confidently, telling her story one more time. This time, no one interrupted her. The company's lawyer tried to challenge the evidence, but it was undeniable. The maintenance logs were real, signed by supervisors. Emails showed that upper management had ignored repeated warnings about equipment failures. Workers had been pressured to keep quiet. It was a cover-up. When the verdict came, the room held its breath. The judge looked at Margaret, his voice quieter now. "Mrs. Thompson, the court rules in your favor." Gasps filled the room. Margaret's knees nearly gave out. She covered her face, sobbing softly. For the first time in 2 years, she felt her husband's memory was honored. His death wasn't forgotten or blamed on him unjustly. The company was ordered to pay full compensation, and a criminal investigation was opened into their negligence. The lawyer who had mocked her left the courtroom without a word. The judge avoided everyone's gaze, but Margaret didn't care about revenge. She just felt peace. Afterward, she turned to Hank and his crew. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Hank shook his head. "You already did, by not giving up." She smiled through her tears. "You're angels in leather jackets," he chuckled. "No, ma'am. Just people who believe that right is right." Before they left, Hank placed something in her hand, a small silver pin shaped like a wheel with wings. "That's our symbol," he said. "Whenever you see it, you'll know you've got family out there on the road." Months passed. Margaret used the settlement money not to live lavishly, but to build something meaningful. She started a small foundation, the Thompson Trust, to help widows and families of injured workers get legal aid. She even partnered with the Guardians of the Road, who helped raise funds and awareness across the state. Her story